but it's called Embryos and Ethics, subtitled The Warnock Report and Debate. The Warnock Report was a British commission that issued their recommendations on how to regulate in vitro fertilization and embryo research and experimentation 20 years ago. Anyway, I am sure this is out of print, but it's Amazon used books. If you can find it, probably won't cost you more than $1 or $2, but it is really worth it. And then the other one that I'd highly recommend is this one. This is real new. Embryo, subtitled A Defense of Human Life. Robert George, you recognize from the Do the Right Thing film clips that we've been showing. That's the same guy. And Christopher Thompson, I believe, he's a philosophy prof at the University of South Carolina. You may be a little disappointed with some of this because it's not a chapter and verse appeal to Scripture. Both George and Thompson are Catholic, and so they reason on this a little differently, and they're trying to make an argument that has appeal to people outside of Catholic and religious circles. Okay? So I assigned this to some of our philosophy students. They weren't super crazy about it because they didn't think it went quite far enough in terms of the theological underpinning. So take that criticism for what it's worth. And then if you want a variety of views that are out there, particularly theologically based, God in the Embryo, religious voices on stem cells and cloning. The editor, Brent Waters, who edited this, is a thoroughgoing evangelical and a great brother. But the volume has it's a variety of theologically based perspectives, and I'm sure you'll find a lot to agree with and a lot to take issue with. And it's a collection of essays on this. So, okay, where we left off last time, I just want to pick up a couple of more little details related to the abortion discussion, and we're going to move on. But remember, we said that there are some who view, some pro-choice folks who view the abortion decision from a different framework than our decisive moments. Remember that our decisive moments along the continuum from conception to birth. And I think a lot of them would agree that the distinctions made along that continuum are somewhat arbitrary, and that there's really no morally relevant difference at any of those points between a fetus one day before the decisive moment and one day after that. Okay? Instead, what they suggest is an entirely different way of framing this in terms of a set of functions that a fetus or embryo or a child has to be able to perform in order to be designated a person. In other words, if you don't have awareness of yourself, if you aren't self-conscious, if you don't have a capacity for relationships, if you can't pass what some call the look in the mirror test, that you look in the mirror and recognize yourself as being yourself. They make the argument that you can't have interest if you don't have awareness of who you are and your surroundings. They would say that's just a basic requirement it's a basic requirement to have a life. Right? Proponents of this view often distinguish between being alive and having a life. And that you can be alive, so it's so asserted, without necessarily having a life. And they would say that it's having a life that makes you a person, not simply being alive. All right, with me on that? Okay. One of the strongest proponents of a view like this is someone like Mary Ann Warren. This is also the view of people like Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Bonnie Steinbach is another one that's you see a lot in this literature. In any of those, if you just Google their works, you'll find ample evidence to back up their claim. So what this does is, instead of giving you a decisive moment, it gives you a set of functional criteria, or as some have put it, functional indicators of when you have a person. All right? Now, on the surface, that sounds really compelling. The idea that somebody who's in a coma would be alive but not necessarily have a life. Or that someone who is a newborn, who is severely handicapped, would be alive but not necessarily have a life. Okay? Sometimes this distinction is made between, another way that's put, between a biological life and a biographical life. Okay? And we'll see when we get to the end of life, this is very relevant for our discussion on euthanasia and assisted suicide. And the work, if you, again, just a lot of the stuff I'm giving you just for future reference when you actually have more of a life, figuratively speaking, of course, than you do now. But the philosopher James Rachels was the one who popularized this dichotomy between biological and biographical life. Question?
Yeah, so this would be part of the bases for the present administration's formulating attacks on Down syndrome children?
I'm not sure if it's articulated quite like that.
Okay.
I don't think they're calling it a non-person tax.
Okay.
At least that would be very bad public relations if they did. What we have said is that we can reduce the incidence of Down syndrome substantially, but do it preemptively. Right? I mean, I can reduce the incidence of just about anything if you will allow me to destroy the ones who have that something that we want to eliminate. That's not all that challenging. Right? Now, what I think we need to be clear about here is that instead of the distinction between a biological and biographical life, I think the better distinction, the clearer one, is a distinction between being a person and functioning as a person. And it seems to me that that abortion rights advocates have gotten this, in terms of their basic philosophical understanding, have gotten this backward. That I'd put it like this: we function the way we do because we are a thing of a certain type. Okay? Because we are a human person, we function in ways that are typical of human persons. Okay? But the converse of that is not true. Right? That just because we function in these ways, that determines that we are a person. Okay, so in order to make sure that we don't get the philosophical cart before the horse, it's important, I think, to distinguish what we are with how we function. Okay? Those are two different things. Because, remember, we said that there are a number of counterexamples that we can use that I think dispel the notion that we are how we function. Right? And we said, I think we mentioned last time, how many of you have ever been under general anesthesia? Right? If general anesthesia functions the way it's supposed to, you lose all of those functions. In fact, if you can pass the look in the mirror test under general anesthesia, you're in a lot of trouble, right? Or if you're in a reversible coma. Everybody known it? Somebody's in a reversible coma? Right? Or maybe for some of you, I may have said this last time, some of you, I suspect, even in a very deep sleep, might lose these functions. Now, the objector will say, but anesthesia, you're just throwing up a smokescreen here, because anesthesia is temporary. Everybody knows it wears off. And so, of course, after anesthesia wears off, you've got a person. Before it's administered, you have a person. So, of course, in the interim, you have a person. I think what the objector doesn't realize is that they've essentially shot themselves in the foot by making that counter-argument. Now, you see what they're doing? What they're saying is that while you're a person before and a person after, but while you're under general anesthesia and without all of those functions, there's something else. Right? And it's often not specified exactly what it is, but there's something else that gives you your designation as a person. Now, it's not spelled out what it is. What I would suggest is that what they're saying is that there's something essential and unchangeable that grounds who you are as a person. Namely, in our theological system, we would say it's our soul that grounds who we are as a person. It's being made in the image of God that grounds who we are as a person, not how we function. That helps determine how we function, but not vice versa. Okay, you with me on that? Okay. So this is why I think we ought not to use the term a potential person to describe fetuses and embryos. Because what's potential there is not their personhood, but their maturity. Right? I think it's clearer to say that fetuses and embryos are persons with potential to mature. Remember, we said not to develop, but to mature into what they already are. Right? And from the first single-celled embryo, all the capacities that embryo needs to mature into an adult are there. And just because you have capacities, this is a really important point, just because you have capacities that are not yet realized doesn't mean that they don't exist. Right? You have capacities to speak Russian. I don't know that any of you have realized that capacity yet. Okay? Whether you've realized it or not is irrelevant to the fact that you possess that capacity that under the right conditions not only could be, but will be actualized. Okay? So just be careful with how we talk about this, because I think that the way we've understood this, a potential person, it's hard to make sense out of what somebody means by that. Question?
Even Dr. Arnold in chapel this morning, talking about our identity and authority, our being as Christians, whether we function that way or not. Paul seems
That's
to
right.
put that in the right order.
This
This is your being, so therefore you will start to function.
right. No, that's right. That's right. Although I'm not sure that Paul had these philosophical categories in mind, but it's a really nice parallel to how we view our identity spiritually speaking. Right? Okay, now just one more component here on this, and you just need to be aware of this. We don't have time for a huge explanation of this, but increasingly, abortion rights advocates are conceding that the unborn child is a person and maintaining that it is justifiable for pregnant women to take the lives of their full-person unborn children. Now, one of probably the classic defense of this is with the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thompson put forth with her analogy. You recall this from the reading? Okay. Her analogy of being kidnapped and hooked up to a world-renowned violinist for blood transfusion for 9 months. And Thompson says, even if you unhook yourself, the violinist dies, you don't have any obligation to provide that aid for that violinist. Okay? Now, think about some of the limits, and there's been tons and tons of discussion on this. But Beckwith, in his book, Defending Life, which we referred to last time, has a really, I think, compelling critique of this argument from bodily rights. That the woman, that just because the baby is a part of the woman's body, the baby is not entitled to the aid of the mother. So goes the argument. Right? Beckwith, I think, points out, I think correctly, that the violinist analogy, strictly speaking, only applies when sex is not consensual. Okay? Only then, I think, is it fair to say that the woman's body has essentially been hijacked by the pregnancy. Okay? That raises a different set of questions. Although in general, I would suggest that, although I have great sympathy for a woman who's been sexually assaulted, that the means by which she becomes pregnant is actually irrelevant to what kind of a thing the unborn child is. Right? Now, in my view, I think there ought to be an exception clause in the law for pregnancy from rape or incest. And the reason for that is strictly pragmatic, because no law that attempts to put limits on abortion has any chance of passing without that exception clause. Okay? But Thompson also makes two assumptions about pregnancy, I think, that are false. Okay? For one, the comparison of an unborn child in the womb to a total stranger that you have been kidnapped and hooked up to, it seems to me is a misleading comparison, because it's really not fair to characterize our offspring as strangers. In fact, our paternal and maternal instincts suggest something quite the opposite of that. But a second assumption I think Thompson makes that is also not true is that pregnancy is akin to imprisonment. Right? That you're hooked up to this violinist and you're sitting there on the bed. The equivalent of being imprisoned is actually nothing at all like what pregnancy is. And I admit every once in a while, women who get really sick during pregnancy are confined to the hospital or confined to bed rest. But the norm is that during pregnancy, most women live their lives, especially after the first trimester, pretty normally. In fact, my wife, with all 3 of our kids, remarked that in the middle 3 months of pregnancy, she's never felt better. Right? Now, granted, at the end, she was ready to, get this over with and be done with it. But I think to equate that to imprisonment is a huge, misleading assumption. Right? Now, ultimately, the problem is that once you, I think we pointed this out last time, once you make the argument, or once you concede that the unborn child is a person, I think the pro-choice proponent really is stuck. Because not only does it become hugely problematic to end the life of a full-person unborn child, and we got the normal caveats apply to this unless the mother's life is in danger. Okay? But we take it even further, and we pointed out last time, I think I was picking on you last time, about being negligent to your children. And hopefully you've straightened up over the weekend. But what follows really from the concession that you have a full person unborn child is that the child actually has a claim on the mother's body for whatever he or she needs to thrive and flourish. We don't often hear much about that. We don't often hear that claim extended. But I think Beckwith is right about that. And it's a very powerful claim. That the analogy, I think, with what we suggested last time, I think is pretty compelling. And again, we generally do not force women who are pregnant to do things that are in the best interest of the children that they're carrying. We don't have laws that prevent them from using drugs or alcohol or anything like that would endanger their unborn child. We tried, but that failed. Okay, so I just want to be clear about that. I would encourage you to Thompson's essay at some point. Beckwith, there's a whole section in Beckwith's anthology, the 25 years after Roe v. Wade, that anthology, that deals with the argument from a woman's right over her own body. So I encourage you to read a little further about that. Now, one more thing, and then we'll leave this. No additional charge for this part, by the way. My guess is, I've been saying this for a while, but probably in the next decade we will be gestating children from start to finish in artificial wombs. Whether or not that's going to be good for children, I think, is a highly debatable point. So it may be that that children who don't have bonding or connection to a person within those first 9 months may be harmed significantly. So it may be that the artificial wombs may be something nice that's used in academic medical centers, but not really much the general public. But what it will do immediately is it will clarify what exactly is meant by abortion rights. Okay? Does that mean a right not to be pregnant, or essentially a right to a dead child? Today, we can't separate those. When artificial wombs are available, in theory, we will. That the day may come when a woman who wants to end her pregnancy may not have to end the life of her child. Right? Now, the other thing this will do is this will allow a window into gestation from start to finish. And it will do, I think it will do technologically for the pro-life cause what the 4D ultrasound has helped do, only really do it on steroids. So I think this has the potential, I think, to really reshape what the abortion debate is about. And the difficulty is it could be good for unborn children in the future as a class, while not necessarily being good for individual unborn children who are maturing in an artificial womb. And I think that's a huge moral tension. We're already using, to my knowledge, synthetic amniotic fluid in some places, so we've already basically got a start on this. But anyway, just sort of, that's something just to keep your eyes open for. And I heard a prediction about 5 years ago that artificial wombs were 5 years away. And I'm still waiting to see that sort of finalized. Okay? All right. Any other questions you want to raise on this before we leave it? Have we had enough on this? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, let's just, so we're really clear about this, we define some of these terms on the quiz, but the first question to raise is, what is all the excitement about with stem cells? Okay. When scientists first discovered how to harvest stem cells from a variety of sources back in the late 90s, this was called, Time magazine called this, quote, the biological mother lode. And I think it's fair to say that it's basically lived up to its promise. The use of stem cells has provided, at last count, probably almost 100 clinical uses and treatments for a variety of things. I have a list on a later slide for those. But we are treating a variety of blood and immune disorders. We're treating some forms of cancer with this, treating some forms of stroke and heart disease with stem cells. It's been very, very encouraging so far. Okay. Now, to be clear, in every one of those clinical uses and treatments, the stem cells have been derived from non-embryonic sources. Those are what we call, what's referred to as adult stem cells. Okay, so what is a stem? I'm all choked up about this. What is a stem cell? What is it? Yeah.
It's a cell that is undifferentiated.
Which means?
Which means that it can be engineered into a different type of cell so that it can replace something.
Okay, right. A stem cell is a blank slate in terms of its function. Now remember, we said there are two types of stem cells. Right? There are pluripotent stem cells, which are total blank slates, right? And then multipotent stem cells, which are partial blank slates. The multipotent stem cells have some writing on the slate already. They are partway down the developmental pathway. All right, so the kinds of stem cells, I told you about my buddy at Chalk, who's has a stem cell lab. He's working with neural stem cells that he actually harvests them from the brains of recently deceased newborns. And they can become any type of neurological cell in theory. And he's working really hard to figure out what those pathways are so that he can treat some really tough neurological diseases. But his neural stem cells will not help you if you've had a heart attack. Okay? All right. Now, remember when we say something that's totipotent can mature into the entire organism. There's no stem cell that's totipotent. What's totipotent are the single-celled embryos. Right? Now, there are actually some species of animals are totipotent. Right? You've been to the beach and broken off one of the points of a starfish. Throw it back in, it becomes the entire organism. We would say all the parts of a starfish are totipotent. Okay? But that's not true of stem cells in any form. Okay? Now there are a couple of different places where we get these from. So they come from a variety of non-embryonic sources, which we call adult stem cells. Right? In general, the adult stem cells are multipotent. And embryonic stem cells are pluripotent. Now, some of the slides at the end of this seem to suggest that real strong separation between those two might not be as warranted as we think. That there are some adult stem cells that do show evidence of being pluripotent. Okay, so I'd say the conventional wisdom is that these are multipotent, these are pluripotent. Okay? That conventional wisdom may not be quite as conventional as we were initially led to believe. Yes.
So your friend who's doing that research on specific types of brain cells, would those be considered embryonic?
No, those are non-embryonic because they are not harvested from human embryos. Remember, he harvests them from the brains of recently deceased newborns.
But they're newborns, so I'm just thinking adult stem cells.
That's where the adult, yeah, that's why it's just a little more cumbersome to use, but it's more accurate to say this. The adult, at least I should put that in quotes. Okay, that's a good clarification, thank you.
So then the only pluripotent may be embryonic.
Right. We're sure that those are pluripotent. Okay? Let's just say, I think maybe it would be unwise to be real dogmatic about all adult stem cells being multipotent only. Okay? That's probably the best way to put it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the embryonic stem cells we actually get in three places. There are three different ways to get them. Okay? Still, the most common way is to harvest them from embryos that are left over from infertility treatments. Okay? Now, I realize we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but when in vitro fertilization is done, unless it's a failure to achieve a pregnancy, in which case you use all the embryos that are created in the lab. But normally, if a couple gets a pregnancy out of IVF, they will have embryos left over in storage. Okay, just take my word for that. I'll explain how that works later. Right? And most of the time, the stem cells are harvested from these leftover embryos that are basically destined to be, thrown down the kitchen sink. Okay? Now, they can also be essentially created from scratch through what's called therapeutic cloning. Basically, what you're doing here is you are creating your own identical twin in the lab. Right. You need some more detail on this? Okay, I've got a slide here that I've... Okay, here's, this part is essentially how this works, okay? So you can ignore all this for the moment, but this is what we mean by therapeutic cloning. What you do is you take one of your cells, maybe a skin cell or whatever, and you take out the nucleus, all right? The rest of that gets thrown away, okay? Now, you transfer the nucleus to what I would do right around here. I would draw a woman's egg that has had its nucleus removed. Right? The result, if everything goes according to plan, is that you get a zygote or an embryo with the nucleus of your adult cell in it, okay, which basically gives this person and this person virtually identical DNA. Okay, now you think, why would somebody want to do that? Right? Well, there's actually a really good reason for wanting to do that. And that is, if you get, let's say you've got leukemia and you need a bone marrow transplant, which, by the way, is really what that's basically a very early form of stem cell treatments. But what do you have to have for a bone marrow transplant to be successful? You have to have a match, right? This is also true when you have basically, kidney or liver transplants or things. You have to have a match. Or you end up taking really powerful anti-rejection drugs that often have very nasty side effects to them. Okay? Now, the best way to do this is to extract stem cells from yourself. But if you can't do that, then the next best way to get a match is to harvest them from embryos that are your identical twin. Okay? That's why therapeutic cloning has been suggested as one of the necessary components for making stem cell treatments workable. Okay? Because you can see, for the most part, if you've got diabetes and we're looking for pancreatic stem cells to inject into your body to produce insulin, those stem cells from an embryo that, say, was the result of IVF from you and your wife, excuse me, are probably I'd say highly likely, excuse me, that they are not going to be useful for you because your body will reject them. So that the embryos that are harvested from, the stem cells that are harvested from embryos left over from IVF, right, may be really useful for research, but they're huge and maybe insurmountable technological obstacles for them to be useful for treatment for specific patients. All right? Now, there's no doubt that we will learn a lot in terms of research from embryonic stem cells. But the idea that, you and your wife's the cells from you and your wife's embryos will necessarily help you, probably not in terms of direct benefit. Okay? All right, so we just need to be clear about why somebody would want to do this. And just remember, too, the rate at which excuse me, we're able to successfully harvest stem cells is still pretty small. And so that getting stem cells out of here fails as often as it succeeds. When I first started, the retrieval rate was about 5% on this. And the success rate of getting from here to here is still quite low. Right? Now remember what we said, what do we have to make this transfer complete? What goes around here? A woman's egg. Right? Now where do those come from? Those have to be donated. Right? Now, as you'll find out, if you haven't sort of figured it out already, women donating eggs is totally different than men donating sperm. Right? I mean, there is no comparison. And it's reflected in how much money you get paid for the donation. Okay? And most women are not willing to donate, quote, donate eggs unless there's, dollars attached to that that's sort of equivalent to paying a year's tuition. Okay? Now we'll see when we get to that part that it is becoming more common for college-age women to donate their eggs, to get out of debt and pay for school and do a lot of other things. And so, for one, this would take, you can sort of do the math on this. If we have, tens of millions of patients who could benefit from stem cell treatments, the number of eggs that are necessary to pull this off is just astronomical. In fact, a group of Korean researchers on this concluded that for embryonic stem cells to benefit every patient who needs them would require a harvest of eggs from every woman of childbearing age. Which is why some advocates are suggesting a plan B here for this. And the plan B is the eggs of certain types of animals as opposed to women's eggs. Okay? And let's just say there's quite a lot of discussion about that, I think, for understandable reasons. Okay? Now, let me go back here. Any questions? Is that all clear as mud?
Just the one question.
Apparently not.
On the development part, so what happens when you're cloning this egg and cloning the I mean, are you growing a whole person, or are you just
Good question.
developing a
Good question.
organ?
Okay. What you're doing is this happens. So here's the embryo. These are the stem cells. Okay. These are harvested, basically, which is the isolate and propagate. Okay. This happens at roughly the 3 to 5 day stage of development. Okay. Now, and again, just so we're clear about this, the only reason that there's any moral dilemma to this is that harvesting stem cells kills the embryo. Right? Now, if we could get to a place where we could harvest stem cells without damaging the embryo, then we might be onto something. And we already are doing something sort of like that. When we do, we'll get to this in a few weeks on genetics, but when you do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where we essentially are taking, basically doing an embryo biopsy. We're taking a cell out of an embryo at the 8 to 16 cell stage and screening it. And the embryo, so far, survives that quite nicely. Right? Now, again, whether that translates to harvesting its stem cells is, full of technological hurdles. But we have what my friend at Chalk called at least proof of principle that it's doable. Okay? Now, the other way to think about getting embryonic stem cells, in fact, so one way is from embryos. So say this could also be an embryo left over from IVF, and you wouldn't have any of this. Okay, so that'd be one. Another way would be to do this, which is therapeutic cloning. Okay, the other term that's used for that is called somatic cell, which soma from Greek for the body, a bodily cell. Somatic cell nuclear transfer is the idea. I was debating this a couple years ago, and somebody had, the person that was my opponent had, I think, the gall to say that that stem cell treatments did not involve cloning in any way. But then went on to say how somatic cell nuclear transfer was critical to the process. And I just said, excuse me? Are you unaware that those are the same thing? Which, of course, she was not unaware of that, but was deliberately trying to obscure the point that it didn't involve any kind of cloning. Right? Now, the other way to do this, which if you go back to here, this is what I'm referring to as induced pluripotent stem cells. Right? Now I'm going to go back to the chart here and show you basically what that means. What that does is essentially starts here and goes backward until you get to something that would be about right here in the process. In essence, what you would do is you would deprogram adult cells. You would just reverse the differentiation process. We've already done this. We have essentially created embryonic-like stem cells without starting with human embryos. Right? It's unbelievable stuff. My buddy at Chalk predicted we'd be able to do this a few years ago, and I think it came about more quickly. In fact, the guys who did this, who not the first time, but who replicated it, were the same researchers that first figured out how to harvest stem cells from human embryos. Right? So, but basically, another way to describe this would be to say that you differentiate adult cells. Right? Now, to be fair about this, there is still a significant debate over what contains the stem cells at the end of this process. Okay? Now, there's some who will say what we have done essentially is create embryonic stem cells. No, that's not true. We've created pluripotent stem cells without creating human embryos. Others will say what you've done is essentially gone back and we basically created embryos moving backward. But that if you at the end of this process, if you implanted this, a woman will become pregnant. Okay? Which if you got your antenna up, what you're realizing is that in attempting to solve one problem, we've just created another one. Okay? So the real debate today is over, whether at the end of this, is this an embryo that's been created or an embryo-like entity which, if implanted, would not mature into a fetus, a newborn. And there is, just so you're aware, there is considerable debate about this. My own view is that we are going back to an embryo-like entity, and that this really does solve a significant problem. But I'm open to being wrong about this. And there have been some pretty influential pieces published that suggest that nothing's really been solved with this. Right? Now, I haven't, it's been a while since I've queried my scientist friend on this. And so I'm probably due for another visit with him on this. But I think this has huge promise. But we need to get a little bit clearer about exactly what do we have here at the end of this. Okay, so you're as up to date on this as I'm aware of.
If it is not embryo-like, but rather is functionally an embryo, then do we have cloning from a different
Yes,
angle?
that's right. It would essentially be another way to do procreative cloning, it would seem. Yeah. Well, yeah. Now, and just so we'll get to this later too, but in this therapeutic cloning, the only difference between that and procreative cloning is that this, instead of having stem cells harvested, would go into a uterus. And if all goes according to plan, the woman becomes pregnant, which would require a surrogate. She becomes pregnant and gives birth to your identical twin. Okay? Now, to my knowledge, nobody has done that today. Or if they've done it, nobody's gone public with it, except for some really oddball cult groups, which is fine with me that they're the poster boys for this. Okay, we all clear on that? What, this right here?
No.
Oh, this is what's called, this is the third one that I've got on that slide. It's the induced pluripotent stem cells. What it goes by is the abbreviation IPS. Okay. Let me move. I'm going to move ahead here just a little bit. You've got a lot of these slides. One of the arguments that's made in favor of using embryonic stem cells. Okay, and remember, there is no moral issue with the use of non-embryonic stem cells. Okay? So please don't be careless and say that you're opposed to stem cell research. Because you better not be. Okay? The part that there are moral questions about is only a very small part of the entire stem cell enterprise. Okay? All right, so just be sure we're clear about that. Okay? So now the ESC is all talking about embryonic stem cells now. Okay? So some will say, look, it's immoral not to use them if they can help someone else. Okay? The response to that is to say, well, not so fast. Got major compatibility problems. I mean, there are huge obstacles to getting over this. Okay? Now, this is a second argument that's made, and here gets more to the heart of it, and that is that an embryo outside the womb is not the same as a fetus developing inside the body of the mother. You know, God bless Orrin Hatch is a very staunch pro-life advocate. But he maintains a distinction between an embryo in the lab and a fetus in the womb. And that's really the heart of this. Is an embryo that is outside the body in storage in a lab, right? And we'll get to this again with IVF, but embryos can be stored in the lab for a decade. Right? They are as I put it, they are the frozen, unchosen. Okay. Now, that's really getting clear about that. What exactly embryos outside the body are, and making that case is the challenging part. Okay? Now, here's the only place where I think the Scripture might speak to this is in Psalm 139. I believe it's in verse 13, where it says, "You knew my unformed substance." I think the way the NIV renders that. Now, I would definitely not go to the stake for this. But there are some lexicons translate that term, unformed substance, as embryo. Okay? Now, whether that's a translation or an interpretation, I'm inclined to think it's probably the latter. Because it's not at all clear to me that in Old Testament times they had categories for distinguishing for these. But I think maybe what I would suggest is that the unformed substance, I think, refer to the biblical writers, I think, assumed that at some point what was growing inside the mother's womb would visually resemble a human being. Right? Now, they didn't have ultrasound or anything like that to validate that, but I think they reasoned that because when a baby comes out looking like a human being, that at some point it starts to look like that in the womb. And if that's true, then at some point you would have a period where it was unformed, where it wouldn't resemble a normal-looking human being. Okay? Now, whether they made a distinction, I just don't think they had any way to envision that there would be such a thing as embryos outside the body. I'm not even sure we envisioned that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, to be sure. Okay, so this is one of those places where I think it's really difficult to expect the Scripture to have much to say that's definitive about this. I was talking about this with a buddy of mine who's on the New Testament faculty at Dallas, and he kept saying, if only the text had something to say. And this is one of the areas where I think you have to think outside the text on this, because the text is not going to determine this for us. Right? Now, what we need, it turns out this is a benefit. What we need is a way of thinking about this that's not dependent on the text. It also makes it a good candidate for persuasion to people who don't care about the text. So we'll just probably have a chance to start on this for today. We've said already that this is a philosophical question. It's not science. Right? So then that's just in an effort to be clear. It's also a bit of an effort to disarm the scientist who's trying to play amateur philosopher. Okay? And to let the scientist know that once we start down this road, unless they're trained in philosophy, they're out of their field. And then we've already said that what is clear from science is that embryos, whether they are inside or outside the body, are both alive and human. Right? Whether they are a person or not is the question. Now, one thing I think we can be clear about is that embryos are not simply clumps of cells. And I would appeal to these folks who there are their frozen embryos and there are their two children who were born after these embryos were thawed and implanted. What these parents recognize is that there's major continuity between the embryos in the lab and the bouncing baby boys that guy's holding in his arms. I suspect any couple that's had children from IVF has the same intuition about that. So to say that they're just clumps of cells, I think is a hard one to maintain. Now, to be fair, I think it's also a little bit counterintuitive to think that something that is so small that takes a microscope to see it could also be a full human person. That one's not easy to swallow either. But I think it's a huge problem to say that embryos are nothing more than just clumps of cells. I mean, at best, if we conceded that, then we'd have to say that fetuses are actually just clumps of cells. They just happen to be bigger clumps of cells and better organized, right? And so on. Right? Now, back. Oops, sorry. Now, here's what I'm trying to. This is the way. In fact, this is the way I made this case in the debate on this. That, shoot, we better stop here. Okay. Think about this for next time. This requires some more explanation than we have time to go into now. But what I want to start, I will start with this next time, in that both our legal system and the way we think about moral responsibility, both say that we assume a continuity of personal identity through time and change. Okay, philosophically, the term we use for that is called a substance. Okay? Now, we'll stop with this. Let's say that you commit a horrible crime, okay? And you don't get caught for 10 years. And 10 years after you commit the crime, you're brought to trial. Okay? Now, we know biologically that basically all your cells basically recycle every 7 years. Okay? And let's say that, God forbid, probably better to use a guy on this, but let's say, God forbid, you go bald. You lose all your hair. And you're in a horrible car accident and you had one of your legs amputated. Okay? So you've lost a bunch of your parts. Okay? You could plausibly say to the judge that I am a different entity. I'm a different thing than when that crime was committed. Okay? Under the assumption that we are nothing more than a collection of parts. Okay? Under that assumption, that actually is a fairly plausible thing to say. Okay? Now, if you tried that, I'm sure you would be laughed out of court. Right? And justifiably so, because we assume that regardless of whether you have your leg amputated or not, you are still the same person. In fact, you could lose half your brain and you wouldn't be half the person. Right? You'd still be the same person with half the brain capacity. Right? So both our systems of criminal justice and moral responsibility assume a continuity of personal identity from the start, okay? Which tells us that the way our common sense view of a person is different than viewing ourselves as just a collection of parts and properties. That there's an underlying, unifying, immaterial essence to who we are as a person. All right?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.